Now to the front pages, bubbling and boiling with one story only. There's the front page of the Mail on Sunday. Bust up Boris, hit by shock poll blow, which is basically that people are not impressed by the latest story and are gathering around Jeremy Hunt as a potential Prime Minister, they say. The Sunday Express is as disobliging to Boris Johnson as that one was. Why won't Boris tell us what happened? That's relating, of course, to the hustings yesterday, where he dodged the questions about the Carrie Simons row. But Carrie Simons, in a more friendly way, has been speaking, or friends of hers have been speaking to The Sun and given her verdict. It's all a stitch-up by left-wing neighbours, and that is also the view taken by the Sunday Telegraph. Left-wing neighbours admit taping Boris' row, and people are asking, what kind of country is it where you can't have a row without your neighbours taping it and calling the police? And there's the Sunday Times. Boris is a security risk. This is allegedly two cabinet ministers gossiping, saying that he will be blackmailed and there'll be further leaks to come out. And they've got a whole series of stories which we'll talk about inside that paper. Very, very interesting. And then finally, the Sunday Mirror. Boris' row was so frightening, I had to call police, says the neighbour involved. So where are we going to start? We're going to start with that story. That is the only place to start.
Yeah, it's everything today is about kind of Boris backlash, and obviously we saw the story emerge in The Guardian on Friday night, and it was all about the row that Boris Johnson had with his girlfriend Carrie Simons, and the neighbours there had called the police and made a recording in their hallway, and then passed that to The Guardian. And now what we've seen over the weekend, and particularly all over the papers today, is the scrutiny has turned from Boris and his girlfriend to the neighbours that made the recording.
So it's gone from the story to the story about the story. And of course this is technology. Because of these mobile phones, anything can be recorded or filmed at any time.
Yeah, and so the newspapers are looking at who are these people, and I think trying to look more into what their motivation is. And the suggestion in some of the papers this morning is that their motivation might be political. That's certainly what's being hinted at in the Sunday Times. This is the way that they describe the neighbours. Their names are Tom Penn and Eve Lee. They are left-wing dramatists. There's some great descriptions of them in here. Lee is an enthusiastic Buddhist. In terms of like her playwriting career, she's getting some.
It all sounds exactly as if it was written by Jennifer Sanders out of Ab Fab. I mean,
yeah, it's quite
great social
silly.
Comedy in a way.
Yeah, and apparently she gave Boris Johnson the finger in the street. So the implication behind all of this is that
it's all a political stitch-up.
There's an ulterior motive here.
Ash.
I mean, I think that this coverage of the political views of the neighbours is actually weirdly McCarthyite. This idea that because they voted Labour, because they were pro-EU, because she gave the finger to Boris Johnson in the street, the way like 50% of Londoners, I think, would, that they shouldn't be trusted, and that their motivations for recording the row, the screaming, the smashing were malign, and that, you know, James Cleverly saying that the big element of the story is that they called the police at all. And the reason why I feel so strongly about this is because I think that this has got negative consequences beyond the Westminster pony show.
For other women who are perhaps shouting in a room and hoping that somebody's going to
Absolutely,
hear them.
Because having a row in which you shout and you say things you don't mean, that's a normal part of relationships. Screaming, get off me at midnight, hearing thuds, hearing smashing, those things aren't normal. Physical intimidation is not a normal part of relationships.
Yeah, we don't know that's what he was doing, of course.
Well, no, but from the recording we don't know whether that was Boris or not, but saying that form of conflict and physical intimidation, no matter what side it's on, is not a normal part of relationships. And to see MPs and right-wing pundits just fall over themselves to normalise it, I think is incredibly irresponsible.
I'm not sure if
Camilla.
it's normalisation. I think there's a bit of context put into how the recordings were made. There's a suggestion here from the guy, Tom, saying that his sole concern was the welfare and safety of my neighbours. And yet at the same time, we have friends of Carrie's here speaking to The Sun, saying at no point did she fear for her safety. They had a row. Lots of couples have them. They questioned some of the behaviour of the neighbours, including posters being put up, anti-Boris, hate mail that they've received, the so-called two-fingered salute, which I believe the female protagonist in this, she tried to delete that from her Twitter feed. You know, I suppose there could be an argument that if anyone else had been affected by this, and if there'd been a recording of perhaps somebody on the left, you would have the likes of Hacktoff's Steve Coogan and Hugh Grant saying, hang on, isn't this a gross invasion of privacy?
I can tell we're not going to agree on this. I'd like to move on, however, to the bigger question, a sense of, does this matter? Is it going to change people's minds? Is it going to derail or change or alter the leadership contest in any way at all? And there's a poll in the Mail on Sunday, I think, which suggests the answer may be yes.
So the first poll in the Mail on Sunday suggests when it comes to all voters, and they've really got up to the minute polling here. So on Thursday, 36% of all voters were in favour of Boris Johnson over Jeremy Hunt, and then by Saturday that had fallen from 36% to 29%, with Jeremy Hunt overtaking Boris and on 32%. If you ask Tory voters, there's less of an impact. So on Thursday, 55% were behind Boris. On Saturday, 45% were behind him. So a little bit of a drop-off, which would be reflected in the hustings of some boos for questions. What's interesting is the effect on actual Tory councillors. It's all very well talking about what the country thinks, but obviously the only people that have a vote are Tory members when it comes to deciding the next Prime Minister. And according to this poll, Comres, in the Sunday Telegraph, Boris Johnson is 22 points ahead with the grassroots.
He felt before this that he was unstoppable, because it was not just that he had a big lead, but that people were saying they weren't going to change their mind either. And that is probably still the overall sense of the papers today.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing, though, about the Mail on Sunday poll is the thing that came up in my mind was that during this leadership campaign, there have been a lot of MPs, a lot of Tory MPs that you wouldn't have expected to support Boris Johnson. I think the phrase around Westminster has been that there are people holding their nose and supporting Boris Johnson. And that is because they believe that he can deliver them a general election
win. They can see where power is going, and they're following it.
And when we get this Mail on Sunday, it's just one poll. We don't know if it's a trend. But that shows that among all voters, you know, Hunt is sort of edging into the lead. So a lot of those Tory MPs might be kind of having second thoughts. It's too late for them, but they might be regretting their decision.
And we've got some very interesting kind of pro and anti-Boris Johnson commentators writing in the paper. Sunday Times has got this big spread of Sonia Purnell writing very vividly about his temper, and on the other side, Andrew Jimson, his biographer, supporting him. They're both biographers, actually.
So they're putting the two sides forward in reaction to what's happened. And what Sonia Purnell is saying is that Boris's temper and his way of treating women is kind of well known in Westminster, and that makes him unfit for office. And then we have Andrew Gimson, as you say, on the other side. I'm not sure where that is, but Andrew Gimson on the other side, who is basically saying that, you know, he's a different kind of politician. This is already priced in. People know that he has a chaotic private life. And people like it because it's exciting, and people think that Jeremy Hunt is too boring.
I mean, the interesting thing about Andrew Jimson's defence of Boris Johnson is that reading it, you feel a bit like you're being gaslit, because in one paragraph you've got Boris Johnson's famous denial that he had an affair, where he says that categorically there was no affair, it's an inverted pyramid of piffle. Then the next paragraph down, Jimson quotes one of Johnson's family members, and he says, oh no, what he really meant is it's none of your business. So, of course, that's not what he meant. It was a categorical denial. It was lying to the public about his private life. You can say whether or not you think those things should be up for discussion, but it was a lie. Next paragraph down is, oh no, it's not really a lie. So even in these defences of Boris Johnson, they can't get around his fundamental dishonesty.
Yeah. For me, the most important story in the papers really was in the Sunday Times looking at the parliamentary numbers, because whether it's Jeremy Hunt who wins this in the end, or whether it's Boris Johnson, the new Tory leader faces a really, really difficult Commons confrontation over Brexit, but much else as well.
Yeah, so they say that Boris Johnson is always one banana skin away from catastrophe, and then when he's actually in office, the suggestion being here in the Sunday Times that within 24 hours Labour will have a no confidence motion. To be fair, speaking to Liam Fox earlier in the Green Room, he made the point that there has to be two no confidence motions, because under the Fixed Term Parliament Act there would be an initial no confidence motion, and then that would have to be cause some kind of
12
recalibration.
Days or something to resolve it.
Having said that, this is where the arithmetic gets interesting. So currently the Tories have a 4-strong working majority. We've had the recall petition for Chris Davies, and it's looking as if the Liberal Democrats might win that seat back. We don't know.
That's Breton and Radnor, which they won in the past, of course.
Exactly, so that would take it down to 3. And there's a number of Tory MPs. The paper here lists Guto Bebb as one, and also Philip Lee, both staunch Remainers. We've got the situation where two of the ballot papers...
been deselected already.
Indeed, and we've got a situation where 2 ballot papers were spoiled, which went down to 1 in the final 5th ballot.
We still don't know who they are.
Still don't know who they are. So is there a point here that some Tories may vote with Labour in a motion of no confidence to bring Boris down. But equally, there are knives to be pulled out of his back at every turn. You've got, on one hand, the Remainers trying to unseat this whole idea that he could take us out with a no deal. You've then got some hardline ERGers like Steve Baker and others saying, if he doesn't make us leave by the 31st of October, we're going to have him. The quote here being, we can make him and we can break him. So it's like as soon as he's in office...
It's a very, very fragile situation
So
to walk
fragile.
into. As a new, I said Philip Lee had been deselected. He hasn't been. I was wrong. He
Yep.
lost a confidence vote. But
That's right.
he's one of quite a few Tory MPs who the Tory whips think might defect the Liberal Democrats. So the whole thing is it's papery
Yes.
thin, really.
There was some plotting apparently in Portcullis House on Thursday afternoon between Lee, Dominic Grieve, Sam Guimard, Richard Harrington and Antoinette Sambach, who are all ardent Remainers, and they're not going to stand by and let Boris bulldoze her through, no deal.
But it's hard to see. One of the things that we have been talking about for a long time is the fact that, yes, it is very precarious for the Tory party, and they could end up in this position where some of their MPs vote against their own government and trigger a general election. Where is a general election going to get us? I mean, that's the question for me, and I'm not sure that anybody else really knows the answer to that.
There is politics happening on the other side of the chamber as well, of course, Ash. There's two interesting stories about Labour I'd like you to mention. One is the Tom Watson story, saying.
So it's a Sunday, which means that Tom Watson's been briefing The Observer. And what he's saying is that Labour have dangerously underestimated the scale of the crisis it faces when it comes to its Brexit position. Tom Watson strongly feels that Labour need to unequivocally take not just a view that there should be a confirmatory vote or a second referendum, that Labour must come out for Remain in full
Our
throat.
hearts are Remain, he said, yeah.
And the thing is, I have some sympathy with the element of this saying that Labour needs to take a stronger line on Brexit. I think that their attempt to depolarise the issue was noble, if doomed. And now they're in a position where they can either harden their Brexit position,
Right.
which is impossible, or pivot towards Remain. I think, however, this idea of our hearts are Remain and our values are Remain is a bit more dangerous. I think that Euroscepticism does go very deep in this country, and it is something which is important to lots of Labour voters, even Labour voters who did vote Remain. And so I wonder if this will prove to be more divisive.
We're almost out of time, but we've got the Yorkshire Post here, so I can't avoid asking about the Northern Powerhouse story.
Of course.
In the Mirror. They're saying basically Theresa May has offered lots of money, but it's not real new money.
No, I mean, it's not real new money. It's just sort of a bit of a... it's part of her, I think, whole thing about trying to carve out her legacy. I mean, it's quite funny, actually, to watch what's going on over the last 2 weeks with Theresa May. It's like she sort of found a to-do list in her house that she's had there for 2 years, and suddenly she started just ticking things off. I mean, we've seen things on, you know, mental health and Windrush, and now we have this promise about the Northern Powerhouse. It's empty. There's no new cash to it. But I feel positive about the fact that some of the Tory leadership candidates have been talking about the Northern Powerhouse, including Boris. So at least it's back on the agenda.
That's a positive way to end. Thanks all very much indeed.